It was 6:45 p.m. on December 22nd, 2024, and the kitchen inside our base housing at Fort Liberty felt colder than the wind outside. My boots were still damp from the shift I had just finished at the intelligence office, and my uniform clung stiffly to my skin. The Christmas dinner had already started, and the smell of roasted ham and cinnamon sugar pies filled the air. My stepfather, Charles Whitmore, stood at the head of the kitchen island with his glass of bourbon in hand, wearing the same smug expression he had carried for years. He always liked to remind everyone that this was his house, his table, and his rules. My mother Linda hovered behind him, nervous as always. Her red dress shimmered under the harsh kitchen lights, but her eyes shifted every time Charles opened his mouth. Around the table were his friends, a few extended relatives, and two contractor partners. It was a night built for him to gloat. I walked in quietly, still in my uniform. The chatter lowered a notch. He turned his head toward me with that thin smile that never meant warmth. Then his hand reached for the white plate resting near the sink. Leftovers from the earlier appetizer sat untouched. He lifted the plate up and held it high, as if to make sure everyone could see what came next. He said slowly and loud enough for every corner of the kitchen to hear, "I'd rather feed these to a dog than to her. At least the dog's loyal." The laughter came like a wave. Not the soft kind that melts into the room, but the kind that stings like wind hitting an open wound. One man slapped his knee. My mother lowered her eyes. Someone muttered, "That's harsh," and still laughed. My chest tightened, but my body stayed still. The fluorescent light above the island flickered slightly, buzzing, making the sound sharper, the air thinner. The plate landed back on the counter with a sharp clink, and it felt like the world tilted just a little. I had been insulted by Charles before, but never like this, not in front of everyone. It was not just about the food, it was about control, about the power he believed he had over me even now. Even after I had worn the uniform for years, even after I had built a life that had nothing to do with his shadow. I stood next to the counter, my hands behind my back, posture straight out of habit. They laughed at me in my own home. The place I had come back to after 16-hour shifts, after field reports and intelligence briefings. The place that smelled like cinnamon and bourbon, but had never once felt safe. Charles leaned closer, eyes sharp and glinting under the kitchen light, and said to no one in particular, "Dogs know their place. Some people don't." His voice was smooth like a blade pressed against skin. That was the moment the laughter around me turned from sound to weight. Heavy, unrelenting. I felt it sink through my uniform and press into my bones, but I didn't flinch. I didn't look down. I didn't cry. I let the silence inside me expand like a black tide. For years I had learned how to swallow his contempt. But that night, I didn't swallow anything. I memorized it. I memorized the way his voice carried through the kitchen. I memorized the way my mother avoided my eyes. I memorized the exact second the laughter turned from casual to cruel. I let the cold crawl through my chest and settle deep, and when his voice faded, when the last chuckle died under the white lights, I turned my head slightly and looked at the clock above the stove. 6:46 p.m. Less than 60 seconds had passed, but something in me had shifted for good. He thought I was standing there humiliated. He was wrong. I was standing there making a promise to myself, one he would never see coming. The room smelled of roasted ham and arrogance. Someone poured more wine. No one noticed how calm my breathing was. They didn't understand what silence can hold. I straightened my collar slowly. My heart beat steady, not frantic. The night was cold outside, but inside me something colder began to rise. A quiet storm with a single purpose. I wasn't going to let this humiliation sit like the others. This was the last plate he would ever hold over my head. If you've ever had someone humiliate you in your own home, stay with me. You'll want to hear what happened next. I was 17 the year everything began to turn into something that would follow me for the next decade. It was the summer after my mother decided she was tired of being alone and married Charles Whitmore, the man she always described as sophisticated, successful, the kind of man who could build a future. He wore tailored suits, had a neat salt and pepper haircut, and a voice that carried through a room like he expected everyone to stop and listen. I remember standing on the church steps after the ceremony in my pale blue dress, watching him shake hands with his contractor friends like the marriage was more of a business merger than a love story. Even then, I felt like a supporting character in someone else's play. Charles was the founder of Whitmore Defense Solutions, a small but rapidly growing contractor that supplied equipment and logistics to bases around North Carolina and Virginia. He made sure everyone knew it. From the moment he stepped into our house, everything became a performance of power. He put up photographs of himself shaking hands with men in uniforms, framed certificates of contracts, awarded glossy pictures of company vehicles parked near hangars. When people came over, he told stories about how vital his work was, how he had friends at the Pentagon, how he understood the language of defense in a way most civilians never would. At first, I stayed quiet because my mother looked happy. After years of trying to raise me alone, I think she liked the idea of being taken care of. But when I got accepted into the Army ROTC program, everything shifted. Charles hated not being the center of the room. He started calling me Army brat in that half-joking way people use when they mean every word. He said it in front of guests at family dinners, sometimes even to my face when no one else was around. "You think wearing a uniform makes you special?" he told me once, leaning back in his leather chair, bourbon in hand. "It just means you follow orders better." That was how he saw me. A girl who could be shaped controlled, folded into whatever picture made him look stronger. When I shipped off to basic training at 18, he made me sign over access to some of the joint household accounts. He called it making things easier for my mom. In reality, it was the first invisible chain he wrapped around me. The account was in both names, but all the activity ran through him. He controlled how much was spent on what and when. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. I was busy learning how to march, how to carry, how to survive in a world built on discipline. I told myself his voice would fade with distance. It didn't. Every time I came home on leave, he found a new way to remind me that I wasn't the one with power. If I spoke too confidently, he smirked and said soldiers shouldn't talk like officers when they haven't earned the rank. When I wore my uniform to a family event, he would say it made the room feel too stiff. If I tried to talk about my training, he cut me off with a story about his company's latest contract, always louder, always longer. My mother never told him to stop. She always looked like she was holding her breath, waiting for the storm to pass. He liked to throw little phrases like darts. "You'll never make it far in the Army. You're too soft. You're not leadership material. You're just a kid playing soldier." When I earned my commission years later, he didn't even congratulate me. He looked at the insignia on my shoulder and said, "Careful, Lieutenant. Some people get too big for their boots." Back then, I tried to fight quietly. I told myself I could outrun him, outwork him, outgrow his shadow. But control isn't always loud. It seeps in through contracts, through signatures, through financial structures that look harmless at first. My name was tied to the house. My signature was on papers that gave him oversight over my housing allowance. When I deployed, he made sure every bill, every decision went through him. He said it was to protect my mother, but we both knew it was about making sure I never felt like the house was truly mine. The image he built outside our walls was impeccable. Charles knew exactly how to talk to officers and contractors. He hosted barbecues for logistics captains, bought them expensive whiskey, bragged about his contracts, and whispered about future deals. He liked to name-drop colonels and majors men who tolerated him because his money was useful. At home, the image twisted. He'd stand in the kitchen with a drink and tell my mother how her daughter would never measure up to him. He'd tell me that loyalty meant obedience. He'd tell me that as long as I lived under his roof, he'd decide how much of my life belonged to me. I remember one night when I was 19, home for a short break before returning to training. I mentioned something about applying for a specialized intelligence track. He laughed. Loud, the kind of laugh that makes everyone else shrink a little. "Intelligence," he said. "You, sweetheart, you're book smart, not real smart. Real smart is knowing who holds the money. Real smart is knowing who calls the shots." He tapped his chest with his thumb. "That's me." That was the night I understood that to him the Army wasn't something noble. It was just another hierarchy to exploit. And me, I was just another pawn in his performance. Over the years, my mother started echoing his phrases. Not because she believed them, but because it was easier than fighting him. She started saying things like, "Don't make him angry, just let him talk, he's trying to help." I learned to move like a shadow in my own house. Quiet, predictable, never giving him too much of myself. But every insult carved its mark. Every signature on a paper he pushed in front of me chipped away at the small spaces I thought belonged to me. He believed control was permanent because no one had ever challenged it. He didn't see the way I watched. He didn't see the way I learned. He didn't see the way silence builds a memory sharper than any blade. Looking back now, I can trace every thread of what happened that night in the kitchen to this decade of quiet domination. He thought he had built an empire of loyalty, but what he had really built was a map that would lead me straight to his weakest point. The first real crack didn't come with a fight. It came in silence, the kind that slips between the moments when you're just trying to live your life. I was 27 then, already a first lieutenant, already wearing the rank that had once seemed impossible. I had spent years building myself into someone Charles couldn't break, or so I thought. But the truth was, he had been building something too behind the curtain, behind the dinners, behind the polished bourbon glasses, and the stories about power. It started with a simple line in my mother's account statement, a deposit that didn't make sense, then another, and then a third. They were buried beneath legitimate payments small enough to seem ordinary to anyone who didn't know where to look. But I knew. I had learned how to track anomalies. That was my job. Patterns, signals, movements hidden beneath the noise. The numbers on those statements were like a whisper in a language I suddenly realized I spoke fluently. It was a late night in my small office at the base when I lined up the transfers one by one. The dates were too precise, the amounts too deliberate. I remembered the way Charles used to say everything in this house runs through me. At the time, I thought it was just another power play, another way to make me feel small. But staring at those transactions, I realized it wasn't just arrogance. It was a confession disguised as a boast. The first time I confronted my mother, she brushed it off. "It's just business," she said. "You know how contractors are." But I could hear the strain in her voice, the kind that comes from living too long under someone else's control. I didn't push her then. I knew better. Pushing her meant pushing against the fortress Charles had built around her. I had to understand it first. So I started listening more carefully at those dinners I used to tune out. The names he dropped, the deals he bragged about, the way certain logistics officers kept appearing at the same events. It wasn't random. It never had been. There was one night in particular that sealed it. A barbecue in our backyard, the kind of event Charles loved. Men in uniform, a few polished contractor types, the sound of cheap country music playing through outdoor speakers. I stood near the edge of the porch in my PT gear, just observing. Charles had a hand on one colonel's shoulder, laughing too loud, telling some story about how smooth procurement could be if you knew the right people. His voice carried like it always did, but it wasn't the laugh that caught my attention. It was the look exchanged between him and a logistics captain I recognized from base. Quick, subtle, practiced. The kind of look you learn to see when you've spent years in intelligence. It wasn't friendship. It was coordination. Later that week, I found an old file folder in my mother's desk. She had hidden it beneath stacks of insurance paperwork. Inside were copies of contracts between Whitmore Defense Solutions and a subcontractor I'd never heard of based in Delaware. A company that looked legitimate on the surface, but fell apart under the first layer of scrutiny. Its address led to an empty office building with 3 other shell companies listed. That was the moment the hair on the back of my neck stood up. This wasn't just arrogance. This was a network. I remembered a night from a few years before standing at the foot of the stairs when he looked straight at me and said, "This is my house. Even your paycheck runs through me." I had been younger then, too tired from training to care, too used to his control to see it for what it was. But now those words played back differently. Not like an insult, but like evidence. A man who thought he was untouchable didn't bother hiding his crimes. Becoming an officer had changed more than just my rank. It changed how I saw the world. It taught me to look for the edges of power, not just the surface. I began noticing small things. The way he avoided certain questions when contractors came up. The way my mother's phone bills had numbers tied to his business partners. The way his car would disappear at odd hours when no meetings were scheduled. Every little piece was a thread, and once you see a thread, you can't unsee it. I didn't storm into the room and accuse him. I didn't throw files on the table. That's what he would have expected. Charles had spent years trying to paint me as the emotional one, the impulsive soldier who didn't understand how real power worked. But I understood better than he knew. Real power doesn't scream. It watches. It listens. It waits. The crack widened when I checked the government contract database. Whitmore Defense had contracts with logistics divisions I'd never heard him mention at home. Some were standard, some were odd. A few were marked as classified subcontracts, which meant someone inside had signed off on them with little oversight. It wasn't illegal by itself, but combined with the Delaware Shell Company, it was a red flag. I saw the pattern forming a puzzle just starting to show its picture. I started printing everything quietly. Contract summaries, payment logs, company registrations, everything I could find without raising alarms. I stored them in a plain folder in the bottom drawer of my desk at the office. No one would look there. No one would know. But every document felt heavier than the last. The more I learned, the less this house felt like home. For years, I had let him talk down to me, call me Army brat act like my paycheck was his to manage. For years, I had kept my head down because keeping the peace seemed easier than setting the fire. But something inside me had started to move. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter. The kind of stillness that comes before a storm. There was one morning when I caught my own reflection in the bathroom mirror and realized how different I felt. It wasn't fear anymore. It was clarity. I wasn't the 17-year-old girl standing on the church steps anymore. I was an officer in the United States Army trained to find what others tried to hide, and Charles Whitmore had been hiding in plain sight. That realization was the first crack. Small, maybe invisible to him, but I felt it running through me like a hairline fracture in tempered glass. One shift, one more piece of pressure, and it would spread fast. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment I stopped being his silent accessory. It was the moment I became his threat. The night I realized what Charles was hiding something inside me went very still. Not the kind of stillness that comes from fear, but the kind that comes from calculation. I had spent years surviving him, bending around him, making myself small enough to avoid the storm. Now I was done bending. But I also knew exactly who I was dealing with. Charles Whitmore was not the kind of man who left loose ends. He was the kind of man who expected control to be permanent. The kind of man who mistook silence for surrender. If I made the wrong move, if I showed my hand too early, everything would disappear behind lawyers' connections and contractor friends who owed him favors. If I wanted to take down a man like Charles, I needed to build my case slowly, deliberately, like a surgical strike that doesn't leave space for recovery. So I started where I knew the cracks were already showing the money. I used the same skills that made me good at intelligence work. Late nights at the base in the quiet office where the hum of the server rack drowned out the world, I traced the financial spiderweb. I pulled archived banking statements, copied digital transfers, and logged every transaction that connected Whitmore Defense to suspicious accounts. I did it quietly. No red flags. No visible searches on shared networks. If anyone ever checked, they'd just see a young officer doing routine research. But in my private folder, a different picture was forming one of layered shell companies' defense subcontracts and payments that didn't belong in legitimate government transactions. Each printout went into a plain manila envelope I kept at the bottom of a file box in my locker. No one but me had the key. I also knew that whatever I found would be useless if I didn't have the right people backing it. So I reached out to someone I trusted, Captain Lynn Carter, CID. She'd worked a few investigations tied to procurement fraud before, the kind of cases no one likes to talk about, but everyone knows exist. She was the kind of officer who listened before she spoke. I approached her after hours in the parking lot behind the CID building where the shadows stretched long under the yellow floodlights. I told her enough to make her understand the stakes, but not enough to endanger the operation if anything leaked. She didn't flinch. She just asked me 2 questions. How long has this been going on? And do you have proof? I looked her straight in the eye and told her I was working on it. She nodded once. No judgment, just calculation. She gave me a burner number and told me to use it only when I was absolutely sure no one could hear. From that point on, every family gathering became something else. I stopped being just the daughter he talked down to. I became the observer, the quiet one, the one who looked like she had finally learned her place. That was exactly what I wanted him to think. While Charles held court at the dinner table, I began carrying a small voice recorder hidden inside my uniform pocket. The device was barely bigger than a stick of gum. Military issue clear audio, even in crowded rooms. I recorded conversations that started out as ordinary talk, but always slipped into power plays. I caught his voice bragging about contracts, mocking officers who didn't play along, hinting at favors owed. I caught the low rumble of conversations with his contractor partners in the living room after everyone else had gone to bed. It wasn't enough to convict him yet, but it was enough to draw a map. I learned to ask small, seemingly innocent questions at the right moments. How much was that contract worth again? Who signed off on that deal? Why Delaware? I said it lightly, like someone trying to make conversation, not someone gathering intelligence. He always answered with the arrogance of a man who believed no one in the room could ever touch him. That arrogance became my weapon. Next, I contacted someone at JAG, Lieutenant Sarah Graham. She was smart, quiet, and careful, the kind of lawyer who didn't take cases she couldn't win. I didn't tell her everything at once. Just that I had growing concerns about financial misconduct tied to a contractor closely connected to the base. She met me at a small coffee shop off post, the kind of place where soldiers disappear between shifts. She listened carefully, stirring her coffee without looking away from me. When I finally said the name Whitmore, her eyes sharpened just a little. She knew who he was. Everyone on base did. She didn't promise anything. She just told me, if you're right, we need clean evidence. No gaps, no weak points. If he's as connected as you say, he'll try to burn everything before it hits paper. That sentence became the anchor of my plan. I kept playing my role at home. I didn't stop wearing my uniform to dinners. I didn't stop letting him insult me in front of people. I didn't stop letting him believe that I was still the powerless stepdaughter too afraid to push back. But behind that mask, every insult became a reminder of why I was doing this. Every smug smile was one more push to keep digging. He thought I was beaten. What he didn't know was that I was documenting everything. At night, after everyone went to sleep, I'd sit in my car just outside the base housing loop with my laptop open, the soft glow lighting my hands as I cataloged dates, transaction IDs, contractor names, voice clip, timestamps, everything. I didn't rush. I didn't make mistakes. I built a chain of proof so tight that when the time came, it would strangle his empire without giving him space to breathe. I also started building a timeline, not just of the money, but of his behavior. What nights he made certain calls, when specific transactions landed, which officers he seemed too comfortable around. It became clear that Charles wasn't just skimming. He was moving funds through a network of fronts, some tied directly to contracts that came out of Fort Liberty. He wasn't untouchable. He just thought no one inside the house would ever turn on him. And while I collected the evidence, I let him keep playing his role. He'd lean over the dinner table, call me ungrateful, brag about how much money he'd made from his last deal, drop little pieces of information meant to make everyone around him feel small. I nodded when I needed to, smiled when I had to, laughed when he expected it. Every act of compliance was one more piece of armor for the trap I was building. The closer I got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. But there was something steady inside me now, a kind of steel that had been forged over years of humiliation. He didn't realize that the same silence he used to control me was the silence I was now using to bury him. By the end of December, I had 3 sets of evidence ready. 1, the financial records copied and organized. 2 hours of voice recordings with key statements that tied him to contractors and suspicious deals. 3, an operational timeline I could hand over to CID without leaving any questions unanswered. Captain Carter reviewed the first package in a quiet office on a Saturday morning. She didn't say much. She just flipped through the files, looked up, and said, "This is enough to open a case." I walked out of that building feeling the air differently. For the first time in years, his control didn't feel permanent. It felt temporary, fragile even. He still laughed at dinner. He still called me army brat. He still believed every word he said was law in that house. But he didn't know the walls were already shifting around him. I had spent years living by his rules. Now I was rewriting them. And the best part was, he hadn't even noticed the war had started. When I finally admitted to myself that Charles wasn't just cruel but criminal, everything around me started to sharpen into focus. His insults, his power plays the way he spoke about contracts like trophies. They were never just about humiliating me. They were about dominance, about keeping me distracted so I wouldn't see what was sitting in plain sight. He wasn't just a stepfather with too much ego. He was a man laundering money through military supply chains, and I was the one person close enough to see the seams. Once I accepted that there was no turning back, I needed more than suspicion. I needed allies, the kind who didn't flinch when power pushed back. I already had Captain Lynn Carter at CID and Lieutenant Sarah Graham at JAG. They were my foundation. But to follow the money, I needed someone inside the finance office. Someone who could read between the lines of federal contracts the way a surgeon reads x-rays. That's how I found a Sergeant David Brooks. Brooks was one of those quiet finance guys everyone underestimated. He knew the system inside out, but more importantly, he hated people who thought they were above it. We met after hours in the base cafeteria long after most people had gone home. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the only sound was the hum of the drink machine. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed as I laid out what I suspected. I didn't use the word laundering. I didn't need to. He saw the bank statements the contractor names the Delaware subsidiary. His eyebrows lifted once, then settled into the kind of expression soldiers get when something stops being a curiosity and turns into a mission. He said quietly, "You realize what happens if this is real." I nodded. He stared at me for a long moment, then said, "Then let's make sure there's no way he can wriggle out of it." From that moment on, it stopped feeling like I was alone in this. Each ally brought something different to the table. Lynn had the investigative authority and the instincts. Sarah had the legal strategy and knew how to make a case bulletproof in court. Brooks had the financial access, the ability to trace transfers that were invisible to anyone without clearance. And me, I had the proximity. I lived in the house of the man they were all going to take down. I was the one who could get close without raising alarms. That gave me an advantage he didn't even know existed. We built the plan like a carefully drawn operation. No sudden moves, no loud noise. The first step was baiting him. I submitted a formal request to adjust my housing allowance, claiming I needed to reroute a portion into a shared household account due to personal expenses. It was a legitimate process one Charles had insisted on years ago to keep control over household finances. I used his own pattern against him. Brooks monitored the transaction from the finance side. If Charles touched that money or moved it through one of his shell accounts, we'd have a traceable lead. While the financial trail was set in motion, I planted something much simpler at home. A recording device in the dining room disguised as a small USB charger. That room was his stage. It was where he performed for relatives, contractors, friends. It was where he felt invincible. I didn't need a confession shouted from the rooftops. I needed the casual arrogance of a man who had no idea someone at his table was listening with a purpose. Every night when the house was quiet, I'd retrieve the audio and catalog it. Hours of laughter, clinking glasses, and layered underneath little pieces of the puzzle. Contracts referenced payments, joked about names dropped. He was his own best witness against himself. But the real turning point came when we traced the Delaware company. On paper, it was called Shoreline Logistics LLC, a clean website, a registered address, and a single listed employee. It took Brooks less than a week to prove that employee didn't exist, and the address belonged to a rented mailbox in an empty commercial park. The real activity came from accounts that cycled funds through Shoreline and back into accounts tied to Whitmore Defense. It wasn't clever, just quiet. Quiet works when no one is looking. But we were looking now. Sarah started drafting preliminary legal frameworks, preparing sealed affidavits that could be pushed to a federal level if we got confirmation. Lynn built a timeline that connected suspicious payments to specific contract approvals. Every time Charles smiled across the dinner table, I had to remind myself not to let it show on my face. He still thought he was the puppeteer. He had no idea the strings were being cut one by one. There was one night near the end of December when everything aligned. Charles came home late from a contractor dinner, flushed with drink and pride. I was in the kitchen pretending to scroll through my phone. He didn't see the way my hand brushed the corner of the table where the recorder sat. He poured himself a drink and started bragging to my mother about how smooth the next quarter was going to be. Something about the airfield procurement contract being locked down. He mentioned the Delaware company by name. He said, "It's like moving money through air. Nobody ever sees it. Nobody ever asks." That single sentence was gold. Not because it was explicit, because it showed knowledge, intent, and confidence. And confidence is what kills men like him in court. The next morning, Brooks confirmed the transfer on the housing allowance. It had hit the shared account and then jumped in less than 48 hours into Shoreline Logistics. That was the moment the trap snapped into place. Lynn's team began quietly building the operational package to hand over to federal investigators. Sarah started finalizing everything with Jag. I tightened the noose from inside the house without him suspecting a thing. The closer we got, the quieter I became. When he insulted me, I didn't react. When he barked orders, I complied with just enough indifference to keep him comfortable. He saw my silence as proof he'd won. He never understood it was the sound of me loading every bullet of evidence I had. The alliance didn't just give me backup, it gave me precision. Brooks identified payment patterns tied to specific dates. Lynn lined those up with his meeting records. Sarah mapped the legal vulnerabilities that would prevent him from hiding behind corporate shields. I lived the double life perfectly. Officer on base by day, silent witness in his house by night. My uniform became armor. My calm became a weapon. On December 28th, we held the final coordination meeting at Lynn's office. It was a gray morning, the kind where the clouds pressed low over Fort Liberty. Lynn laid out the operational timeline on the whiteboard. Brooks pointed to the accounts that would be frozen. Sarah reviewed the legal triggers that would allow the feds to step in the moment the evidence was made public. I sat at the end of the table, hands clasped, listening. For years, he'd made me feel powerless. That morning, for the first time, I felt the weight of power settle into my own hands. We decided the exposure wouldn't happen in some sterile courtroom or quiet back room. It would happen in his domain. The same kitchen where he'd humiliated me. The same house where he'd declared himself untouchable. I would stand where I had stood when he compared me to a dog and take everything from him without raising my voice. That night, I walked back into that house and looked around at the walls, the polished wood table, the carefully curated photographs of him shaking hands with officers. They looked smaller now. Not because they had changed, but because I had. He didn't own this place anymore. He didn't own me. By the last day of December, every piece was locked in place. The audio recordings, the banking transfers, the contractor logs, the Delaware shell structure. Lynn's team was ready. Sarah had the legal paperwork prepped. Brooks had his monitor set to flag any last-second movement. And me, I was standing in the eye of a storm I had built with quiet hands. He still laughed at dinner that night. He still raised his glass like a king. But the walls were already cracking, and the man who thought he ruled everything had no idea that the girl he'd spent a decade humiliating was about to burn his empire down. I remember the exact sound of his laugh that night. Sharp, confident, like someone who believed the world belonged to him. It was the same laugh he had used for years to humiliate me. But this time, I wasn't just listening. I was timing. I stood still in the corner of the kitchen, the same corner where the cold December air seeped in through the base housing window. My uniform sleeves still smelled faintly of motor oil and paper from the office, a faint reminder that my real world existed outside these walls. The house was full again, just like it had been so many Christmases before. Relatives, a few of his contractor friends, some neighbors who liked to orbit his power. My mother stood near the sink, tense. Always tense, the way someone stands when they have spent too many years bracing for the sound of his voice. The Christmas lights blinked faintly around the window, casting small red and green reflections on the linoleum floor. He stood at the head of the table, glass in hand, smugness sitting heavy on his face. He raised the plate of leftovers like a trophy and said the same words that had cut through me earlier. "I'd rather feed these to a dog than to her. At least the dog's loyal." The laughter came like a practiced chorus. A contractor friend slapped the table. My uncle chuckled awkwardly. My mother lowered her eyes. Someone even whispered brutal but still smiled. The sound didn't cut through me this time. It fueled me. Every note of that laughter was another nail in the coffin he didn't know was already waiting for him. I let it wash over me. I didn't flinch. I didn't answer. I let him believe he'd won again. He leaned back against the counter, proud of himself. The noise in the kitchen rose again as people tried to carry on like nothing had happened. That was always how it worked. He humiliated, they laughed, the night moved on. But this time, the night wasn't going to move on. I glanced at the clock above the stove. 7:13 p.m. Right on time. I walked slowly to the edge of the dining room where my laptop bag was resting against the chair. I'd placed it there hours earlier. The cable was already connected to the small portable projector aimed at the blank wall beside the table. A quiet insurance policy. He didn't even notice me moving. He was too busy enjoying his own echo. I set the laptop on the table, clicked a single key, and the soft glow of the projector filled the wall. A few heads turned. At first, no one really paid attention. They thought maybe I was showing some family slideshow. It wasn't until the first line of a bank statement filled the wall in crisp white and blue that the room fell quiet. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The first slide showed the logo of Shoreline Logistics LLC, his fake Delaware company. The transaction dates ran across the top. Direct payments from Whitmore Defense lined the columns. And then, clear as the light on the wall, outbound transfers to accounts tied directly to him. Someone in the room shifted uncomfortably. His friend Marcus, a contractor who had been laughing the loudest, leaned forward as if squinting would make the numbers disappear. Charles' voice cut through the silence, brittle around the edges. "What the hell is this?" His tone carried a tremor he probably didn't even hear himself. I turned to face him, my hands steady at my sides. "You tell me." He started to step forward, his eyes flashing, but then the audio kicked in. The room filled with his voice, recorded crisp and clear from one of his many late-night bragging sessions. I could almost feel the moment the temperature in the room shifted. On the wall, the projector slide gave way to a waveform audio visualizer as his voice played. "I'd rather run it through Delaware. Nobody ever checks Delaware." The contractor laughed on the recording. "Easy money." And Charles replied, "Like moving it through air," the same line he'd said to my mother weeks earlier. The laughter that had filled the room only minutes ago dissolved into something brittle and sharp. Someone near the back of the kitchen whispered, "Oh my God." The audio kept playing, clipping through pieces of conversation he had with two of his contractor friends. Names, contract numbers, specific shipping container references. Every sentence carved a piece of his empire open for everyone to see. He lunged toward the table, but I had already stepped aside. Lynn's team had helped me set this up carefully. The audio and files were stored remotely mirrored onto 2 backup drives. I wasn't stupid enough to keep everything on one machine. He couldn't stop it even if he tried. The next slide appeared automatically. Financial transfers, contract documents, emails with signatures. The name, Whitmore Defense, was repeated over and over. And at the bottom of every page, Shoreline Logistics LLC. Someone gasped when they recognized their own name on one of the CC lines of an email. One of his friends, Bradley, stepped back from the table like it might burn him. Charles's face went red, then pale, then red again. He shouted something about how this was a misunderstanding, how this was private business, how I didn't know what I was doing. But his voice didn't carry the same power anymore. He looked smaller somehow. It wasn't the evidence itself that broke him. It was the eyes. All those eyes looking at him no longer in awe, no longer laughing, no longer playing along. My mother whispered, "Rowan, what are you doing?" Her voice wasn't angry. It was scared. But I couldn't stop now. I wouldn't. For years, I had watched him turn every moment into a stage. Tonight, the stage was mine. The final clip played then. His voice from 2 weeks earlier. At least the dog's loyal. Only this time, it didn't sound powerful. It sounded petty, cruel, small. And layered right after it was another clip. Him talking to his friend Marcus about moving funds through the housing account I'd baited. "If she keeps quiet, it's clean. If she talks well, we'll burn the paperwork." The room had gone silent long before, but that line was the death knell. It echoed in the kitchen, sharp and metallic. Charles turned toward Marcus, his face twisting. Marcus stepped back, hands raised. "Don't look at me, man. You said all that." People started murmuring. Relatives who had never dared question him whispered to each other. One of the contractor friends grabbed his coat. Someone else muttered about calling their lawyer. I stood perfectly still and let the weight of the moment do the work. The projector was still glowing against the wall, showing the final summary page. Transfers, amounts, signatures, voice, face. Everything tied together in a neat, devastating knot. My stepfather, the man who had spent years calling me weak, the man who had built a small empire on arrogance and corruption, was no longer the center of the room. He was the target. His voice cracked. "Turn this off right now." I tilted my head slightly. "No." He lunged then, faster than I expected, reaching for the laptop. But before his hand could touch it, a sharp voice from the doorway froze the room. "Federal CID, step away from the table." Lynn's team had arrived exactly on schedule. She stepped through the doorway in plain clothes, but with a badge that caught the light just enough. 2 agents followed behind her, calm, efficient. They didn't storm the room. They didn't have to. The evidence was already on the wall. He spun toward them. "You can't come in here. You don't have a warrant." Lynn held up the folded paper. "We do." The sound of his breathing was loud enough to hear across the room. He stepped back, tripping slightly over the edge of the rug. His glass fell to the floor and shattered. No one moved to help him. Not my mother, not his friends, not a single one of the people who had laughed minutes earlier. Lynn's voice was calm, almost soft. "Charles Whitmore, you are under investigation for federal contracting fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering." She listed the charges with the same rhythm soldiers use when reciting coordinates. Precise, unshakable. He shouted something about mistakes, about misunderstandings, but nobody in that room believed him anymore. As the agents started moving through the house, collecting the evidence they had been tracking for weeks, I felt the cold air from the window brush against my face. This house had never felt so quiet. I turned toward the table, the same table where he had made me feel small for years, where he'd compared me to a dog, where I'd sat through endless humiliations just to keep the peace. Now everyone's eyes were on him. Not me. Him. They laughed at me minutes ago. Now no one was laughing. The contractor friends tried to distance themselves. One of them stammered about not knowing anything. Another tried to leave, but an agent stopped him politely at the door. My relatives looked pale, as if the foundation they had trusted had just crumbled beneath them. And maybe it had. For years, Charles had convinced everyone that he was untouchable. Tonight, they watched him crack. When Lynn finally nodded to me, it wasn't with pity or with a smile. It was with the look of someone who understood exactly how much it takes to hold your ground for years and then pick the perfect moment to strike. My mother stood frozen, tears glinting in her eyes. I didn't speak to her. Not yet. The truth was too loud in the room for any words to matter. As the agents led him toward the door, his face twisted in a mixture of rage and disbelief. "This house is mine," he hissed at me. His voice was lower now, smaller. I looked at him steady and cold. Not anymore. He stumbled once on the threshold, caught between the warmth of the house he thought he owned and the winter night that waited outside. The cuffs clicked around his wrists like the closing of a long, quiet chapter. The guests filed out slowly, murmuring, unsure of what to say. The ones who had laughed the loudest were the quietest now. Some couldn't even look at me. Others whispered apologies they didn't mean. I stood in that kitchen, surrounded by the echoes of a night that had finally broken its own cycle. For the first time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt clean. The projector still cast its light across the wall, the numbers and names glowing like the truth itself. And for once, he couldn't talk over it. He couldn't twist it. He couldn't bury it. This was his empire collapsing not in fire or fury, but in precision, in evidence, in the quiet revenge of a woman who had waited long enough. Outside, the December wind swept across Fort Liberty cold and sharp. I breathed it in slowly. My heart wasn't racing. It was steady, measured. I had imagined this moment for years, but I'd never imagined how quiet it would be. Not the silence of fear, the silence of something ending, something finally breaking free. He had built his throne in this kitchen on the backs of other people's silence. Tonight, it wasn't my silence anymore. It was his, and it was deafening. The night after the dinner felt like the quiet before a storm that no one could stop. Except the storm wasn't coming. It was already here. By the time Charles was led out of the house in handcuffs, the operation Lynn had built with Jag and the feds was already in full motion. They didn't need to plan anymore. They had been waiting. As the house emptied and the last guests slipped out into the cold Fort Liberty night, I stood at the kitchen window and watched the convoy of black SUVs turn down the street, their lights cutting sharp lines across the frosted ground. I had thought I'd feel triumphant, but what I felt instead was something quieter, heavier. Finality. Before dawn, CID executed the first search warrant. It wasn't loud like in the movies. It was surgical. Silent boots clipped voices, flashlights sweeping across files, computers, safes. I watched them work from the side, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee I didn't remember making. They moved through his office first, the room that had always been off limits to everyone except him. I'd grown up passing that door, listening to his voice on late-night calls, hearing the click of locks. Now that door hung open. His desk drawers were emptied, his safe cracked. Every file, every hard drive, every paper he thought was untouchable was carefully documented, bagged, tagged, and carried out. It was strange watching people strip the power from a man who had seemed invincible in this house. His presence had always filled every room before he even walked into it. But that morning, it wasn't his voice filling the air. It was CID agents quietly reading serial numbers, JAG officers signing chain of custody forms, FBI agents marking evidence boards with quiet precision. Lynn walked through the hallway like she'd been here 100 times before her badge clipped to her belt, her face calm. She didn't look at me as she passed, but there was something solid in the way she moved, the way the whole operation moved, like this was never in question. Like they'd been waiting for the dominoes to start falling. The first domino fell when the financial orders went out. Jag froze every account tied to Whitmore Defense Charles and his Delaware shells. The notification hit before sunrise. Payrolls, contractor payments offshore, accounts, all of it locked in place. Money had always been the foundation of his power, the thing he lorded over everyone, including me. That morning, it evaporated. By 9 a.m., the FBI had joined the operation officially. The presence of federal jurisdiction turned the case from local embarrassment into national interest. The contracts Charles had signed weren't just base-level procurement deals. Some of them touched federal supply chains, transport logistics, and cross-state defense contracts. That meant the Department of Justice had weight in it now. That meant every hidden deal he thought would stay buried in Delaware mailboxes was now evidence on federal servers. Fort Liberty runs on rumors faster than most cities run on electricity. By midday, word had spread through every unit. Someone at the logistics division had been arrested. Someone connected to a defense contractor was in custody. Someone had exposed a fraud ring. It didn't take long for names to surface. When people whispered Whitmore Defense in the hallways, they whispered it like it was a curse. I walked through the intelligence building that afternoon with my uniform pressed tight and my head held high. For the first time in years, no one looked at me like his stepdaughter. They looked at me like the woman who had pulled the thread that unraveled a very big knot. It wasn't pride I felt. It was something colder, sharper. Justice doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like steady, unstoppable pressure. By the second day, contractors started backing away from him like he carried a plague. Phone calls went unanswered. Texts were left on read. Investors who had once boasted about their connections with Whitmore Defense were scrambling to disassociate. I overheard one of his longtime partners at the base coffee shop telling someone he barely knew Charles. They all distanced themselves the moment the heat turned real, and the empire began to crack faster than I'd ever imagined. One by one, contracts were suspended. Suppliers halted shipments. Accounts were flagged for review. The company name was added to the federal contractor watch list and then the blacklist. That was the death sentence. No one does business with a blacklisted contractor. Not in defense. Not anywhere. It was surreal seeing something he'd built with such arrogance crumble so quickly. It wasn't because of rage or vengeance. It was because the truth doesn't need to scream. It only needs to be undeniable. The media picked it up next, a small story at first, a defense contractor under investigation for fraud at Fort Liberty. But with the federal involvement, it spread fast. Major networks picked it up by the end of the week. They used words like scandal, corruption, breach of trust. They showed pictures of his house, the company building, even his face pulled from public event archives. I didn't give a statement. I didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than anything I could have said. Inside the house, everything felt hollow. My mother wandered from room to room like she didn't recognize the walls anymore. She wasn't a criminal, but she was entangled in his empire. Her name was on joint accounts. She'd signed tax documents she never read because she believed him. That belief was unraveling now, just like everything else. She sat at the kitchen table one night, staring at a stack of frozen account notices and unpaid contractor letters, her hands shaking. I didn't know what to say to her. Part of me wanted to comfort her. Part of me still remembered all the nights she stayed silent when he humiliated me. Silence has consequences too. On the third day, I was called in for a formal debrief with JAG and CID. They laid out the chain reaction in simple terms. Multiple contracts flagged, 2 senior officers at logistics implicated in approving fraudulent deals. Whitmore Defense blacklisted, assets frozen. Federal indictment process underway. Everything I had spent months collecting was now evidence in an active case that stretched far beyond our house. Lynn sat across the table from me in that small, cold briefing room. She didn't give speeches. She didn't tell me I was brave. She just slid a piece of paper across the table. It was the formal acknowledgement of my role as the key witness in the investigation. She said softly, "This is going to get bigger." I nodded. I had known that the night I pressed play on the projector. By the end of the week, his company had lost 3 major investors. His partners filed civil suits against him to save their own skins. People he had called friends refused his calls. The lawyer he had used for years dropped him. The empire he built on arrogance and untraceable money was vanishing in real time, and all I had to do was keep breathing. The house itself changed too. It was no longer filled with the heavy noise of his presence. No more late-night calls echoing down the hallway. No more rigid dinners with laughter that cut like glass. It was quiet now, but it wasn't peace. Not yet. My mother finally looked at me one night, her eyes red. She asked, "How long did you know?" I told her the truth. Long enough. She didn't answer. She just looked down at the paperwork at the accounts frozen in both their names. She had lived in his shadow so long she didn't even know what life outside it looked like. The FBI released an official statement after the first week. Multiple shell companies, tens of millions in fraudulent contracts, an ongoing investigation with multiple sealed indictments. Charles was being held without bail pending trial. He wasn't a king anymore. He was a liability. I didn't celebrate. I went for a run on base at dawn like I always did. The winter air bit at my face sharp and cold, but it was cleaner somehow. No whispers behind me. No weight on my shoulders. Just my breath in the air and the sound of my boots hitting the pavement. Fort Liberty is a place that remembers. People talked. Not in pity, not in shame, but with a kind of respect I hadn't felt in years. Someone in the D-Fassy line nodded at me one morning and said nothing. That silence said more than words ever could. The empire had fallen, but the shock waves were still spreading. And standing in the middle of it all, I felt something I hadn't felt in a decade. Control. Not over him. Over myself. Over my story. Over the silence that he no longer owned. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't dramatic music. It was dominoes falling exactly where they were always meant to. And for the first time, I wasn't trapped under them. I was the one who pushed the first tile. 1 week after the night everything broke open, the sky over Raleigh was the color of wet stone. The courthouse loomed gray against a cold January wind, the kind of day where the air felt heavy enough to press against your chest. I had just finished a meeting with JAG about my upcoming testimony, and all I wanted was to get in my car, drive back to Fort Liberty, and run until the noise in my head settled into silence again. But as I stepped down the courthouse steps, there he was. Charles. For a second, I almost didn't recognize him. The man who used to walk through rooms like he owned oxygen itself now stood hunched thinner than I remembered, like the weight of losing everything had carved him down to a shape too small for the world he'd built. He wore a wrinkled gray coat that hung too loose on his shoulders. No tailored suits, no gold cufflinks, no whiskey in hand. Just him. A man stripped down to the bone. His hair, once combed back like he had something to prove, now hung limp, streaked with a few strands of gray I hadn't noticed before. He called my name the way people call out in a storm, loud, desperate, like if they don't get a response, the world might swallow them whole. Rowan. I didn't stop. My boots echoed down the steps, steady, measured. He moved closer, slow and stiff. I could see the ankle monitor beneath the hem of his pants, a small plastic reminder that he no longer decided where he could and couldn't go. The man who once barked orders at everyone now needed permission to breathe in certain zip codes. He stepped in front of me near the sidewalk, hands half raised, like someone who still couldn't decide whether to beg or command. His eyes darted to the security guard by the door, then back to me. His voice cracked in a way I'd never heard before. "Rowan, please. I raised you. Don't let them destroy everything. Help me fix this." For a long time, I just looked at him. He didn't realize how many years I had imagined this moment, not this exact setting, not these exact words, but this feeling. The moment when he would stand in front of me with nothing left to weaponize. No money, no power, no audience. Just him. The man who thought he was untouchable, now caught between courthouse steps and the empty space where his empire used to be. I thought of all the times he had made me feel like my existence in his house was conditional. I thought of every dinner where I'd sat still while he threw words at me like knives and everyone else laughed. I thought of the recording of his voice projected on that wall, the way the room had turned against him without me raising mine. And then I thought of the younger version of myself, the one who used to shrink under the weight of his control, the one who believed silence was the only way to survive him. I let out a slow breath. "You destroyed yourself." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't flinch. I didn't even look away. The words left my mouth like fact, not emotion. And that was what broke him more than anything, because for the first time he couldn't twist what I said. He couldn't grab it, spin it, and throw it back at me. His face crumpled just slightly, not into tears, not yet, but into the kind of raw, unfamiliar panic that comes when a man realizes his power was never real, only borrowed. His lips parted like he wanted to argue, but nothing came out. His hands dropped to his sides. I saw him searching my face for the girl he used to control, the one who would bend. She wasn't there anymore. She hadn't been there for a long time. "You can talk to your lawyer," I said evenly, "but I'm not saving you." He stepped forward like he might reach out, and the security guard by the door shifted. I didn't step back. I didn't need to. The distance between us wasn't measured in feet anymore. It was measured in everything he'd done and everything I'd taken back. He tried again, the desperation louder this time. "They're going to take everything. They already have," I said. He swallowed the movement sharp against the gray light. "You don't understand. They'll come after your mother. They'll come after everything." I tilted my head slightly. They already have. And maybe they should have. For years, he had lived in a world where people believed his voice was the loudest in the room. Now, the only thing louder was the silence he couldn't fill. His voice faltered, breaking down into something thin. "Rowan, we're family." That word hit the air and fell flat. Family. The word he'd used like a chain. The word he'd twisted until it meant obedience, silence, humiliation. He never meant family. He meant ownership. And now it was gone. I met his eyes and said quietly, "You don't get to use that word anymore." He stood there, shaking his breath, fogging in the cold air. The wind whipped through the parking lot, tugging at his coat. It made him look smaller somehow, like a man drowning without water. He tried one last time, not with power, but with something uglier. Guilt. "Rowan, I gave you everything. I raised you like my own. No. You raised me like someone who had to earn her place. And I'm done earning." There was no cinematic crescendo, no screaming, just a slow, quiet realization settling over him like the weight of his own choices. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The courthouse doors opened behind me, and a lawyer in a dark coat brushed past, not even glancing at us. Life went on. The The world didn't revolve around him anymore. Finally, he let out a sharp breath, one that sounded too much like a man trying not to break in public. His eyes dropped to the sidewalk, then to the ankle monitor. He wasn't a king anymore. He was a man on borrowed time. A man who had built an empire out of arrogance and cruelty and was now watching it rot from the inside out. He whispered, "Help me." I whispered back, "No." He stood there a second longer, like he thought maybe I'd change my mind, but I turned and walked away. The sound of my boots on the concrete was steady, cutting through the air, sharper than his voice ever had. He didn't follow. He couldn't. Behind me, I could feel the weight of him crumbling. Not in some grand spectacle, but in the quiet way men like him always crumble when the world stops listening. By the time I reached the end of the block, the courthouse doors had closed again. The winter air bit against my cheeks. It was the same cold that had filled the kitchen that night when he mocked me, but now it didn't feel like something I was standing against. It felt like something I was breathing in. I didn't need his apology. I didn't need his remorse. I didn't need anything from him. That was the part he could never understand. He'd spent years believing everything had a price, but my freedom didn't. As I reached my car, I looked back once. He was still standing there, hunched, his coat whipping in the wind, just another man with nothing left to bargain with. The image burned into my mind, not as a victory, but as a reminder. Power built on humiliation is fragile. It only takes one moment to collapse. When I closed the door and started the engine, the courthouse disappeared in the rearview mirror. So did he. He'd lost the house. He'd lost the company. He'd lost the people who used to orbit him like he was the sun. He'd lost the power to make me flinch. And I didn't just win. I walked away. The federal courthouse in Raleigh felt colder than outside. March wind rattled through the narrow alleyways downtown, but it wasn't the wind that made me tighten my grip on the folder in my hand. It was the weight of 10 years. 10 years of control of his voice, filling rooms of my silence pressed down like a boot on my chest. And now here I was, walking through metal detectors under the steady gaze of marshals on the day it would all end. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished floors and stale air, the kind of stillness that only exists in places where justice moves slowly but decisively. The halls were filled with reporters outside, murmurs from civilians inside, and the low hum of federal procedure. But all of it blurred into the background. Today wasn't about noise. Today was about facts. I walked past the courtroom doors with JAG officers on either side. Lieutenant Sarah Graham walked just behind me, her legal pad tucked tight under her arm, her face composed and steady like always. She didn't have to say anything. The look she gave me as we stepped through the heavy wooden doors said enough. We'd built this moment brick by brick. It wasn't just about exposing him. It was about making sure he never got to rebuild the house of silence he had constructed around so many of us. The courtroom was full. The prosecution table was stacked with files, the kind of stacks that meant there wasn't a single hole left in the case. Lynn sat further back in civilian clothes, but I could see the faint flash of pride in her eyes when our gaze met. She had helped tear the threads of his empire apart, piece by piece. Brooks from finance was there too, quiet, solid, leaning slightly forward with his hands clasped. This wasn't just my war anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. Charles was already seated at the defense table when I entered. Even in a suit, he didn't look like the man he used to be. Prison did that. The arrogance was gone from his posture, replaced by something coiled and brittle. His hair was cut shorter, thinner. His skin was pale. But what struck me most wasn't how much smaller he looked. It was the way his eyes flickered when he saw me walk in. Not anger exactly, not hatred. Something worse. Recognition. The kind that lives between people who have shared a house and a war at the same time. The judge entered and the courtroom rose. It wasn't the sound of boots or shouting or rage. It was quiet, structured, inevitable. I felt the weight of every word that was about to be said settle against the floor like iron. The prosecution laid everything out with the precision of someone holding a scalpel. Offshore accounts, shell companies, fraudulent defense contracts, recorded audio of his own voice bragging about how easy it was to move money through Delaware, signed contracts with forged oversight, the transfers tied to his name. They didn't need drama. The numbers were enough. Then came the witnesses. Officers from logistics testified about irregular procurement approvals. Brooks explained the money trail with calm certainty. Lund described the investigation timeline that ended with his arrest. Each testimony was another brick sealing the walls of his cell. His defense attorney tried to paint him as a man under pressure, a businessman who had made bad choices, a victim of a system too complex. But every time they tried to soften the edges, the evidence cut sharper. And then it was my turn. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times in the quiet of my own kitchen in the early morning hours before PT on the track under the cold Fort Liberty sky. But no amount of rehearsal prepares you for standing in front of the man who once made you feel like you belonged in the shadows. The clerk handed me the small sheet of paper with my statement, but I didn't need to read it. I had lived every word. I walked to the podium, straight back to my dress uniform, immaculate. My hands didn't shake. My breath didn't catch. I looked at him first, not because I needed to, but because I wanted him to see me standing exactly where he never thought I'd stand. My voice was clear. For 10 years, I lived in a house where silence was the price of belonging. For 10 years, he made me feel like loyalty meant letting him humiliate me in front of people who called themselves family. For 10 years, he wrapped control in the language of care power in the disguise of protection. And I stayed silent, because that's what people like him count on. Silence. The room was still. No papers shuffled. No chairs creaked. I continued. He thought loyalty meant silence. He was wrong. My eyes didn't leave his. He looked down once, the first crack in what was left of his facade. He used my name to make himself look powerful. He used my silence to make himself untouchable. But loyalty isn't obedience. Loyalty isn't letting someone rot the bones of a system meant to protect people. Loyalty is standing up and saying no more. I told them about the humiliation, about the way he used dinners as a stage, about the plate of leftovers, about the dog. But most of all, I told them about the quiet where he thought nothing would ever touch him, the quiet where I built the trap that did. I ended simply. I will not carry his silence anymore, and neither should anyone else. Then I stepped back. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The weight of those words landed exactly where they were supposed to. The judge's sentencing came after the final arguments. The charges were clear: money laundering, wire fraud, federal contracting fraud. The evidence was airtight. When the judge spoke, the words fell like steel. 14 years in federal prison, permanent disbarment from any defense contracting, all federal assets seized, restitution to the government. Charles didn't look at me when the sentence was read. He stared straight ahead like a man trying to convince himself this was temporary. It wasn't. JAG officials were already moving to revoke every license tied to Whitmore Defense. His name would be wiped from the registry by the end of the day. There would be no comeback, no quiet network waiting to save him. He wasn't a man with influence anymore. He was a number in the system. I turned my eyes toward the gallery and saw my mother. She looked pale, older than I remembered, like the past few months had carved new lines into her face. But there was something else in her eyes, too, something like exhausted clarity. She had cooperated with investigators. That was why she wasn't in a cell next to him. But she had also lost everything. Her house, her money, the illusion of safety she had wrapped herself in for a decade. The marshals stepped forward to escort him out. The sound of chains was faint, almost delicate, a small metallic click that cut through the courtroom air like a blade. I had thought I'd feel satisfaction when this moment came. But it wasn't satisfaction. It was something quieter, steadier. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. He turned his head once as they led him away. Just once. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I didn't even blink. That was the last time I saw him as a free man. The judge banged the gavel, and just like that, 10 years of cruelty, control, and arrogance ended with the sound of a single wooden strike. Outside, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. Questions flew like sharp stones in the wind. I kept walking. Lynn walked on one side of me, Sarah on the other. The crowd wasn't for me. It wasn't about me. It was about what he represented, the quiet corruption people like him think they can get away with. A few steps down the courthouse stairs, I stopped and tilted my head toward the sky. It was still gray, but the air felt different, lighter. Behind me, somewhere deep in the courthouse, the sound of metal doors closing echoed faintly. That was it. No more shouting, no more nights spent listening to him tear people down to build himself up, no more pretending. He thought loyalty meant silence. He was wrong, and I was done being silent. The spring air in Fayetteville carried a quiet kind of warmth, the kind that didn't demand attention, just settled softly around you like a long exhale after holding your breath too long. By April, the last traces of the investigation were behind me. The house on base where I had lived for years, where I'd been silenced, watched, and humiliated, was empty now. The walls no longer carried his voice. The dining room no longer echoed with the sound of forced laughter. I closed that door without looking back. I didn't need to. I found a small house a few miles from the base tucked behind a row of pines. It wasn't big. It didn't have polished floors or walls covered in family portraits pretending to be happy. But it was mine. When I walked inside, there was no weight in the air. No one waiting to make me feel small. No one deciding who I was allowed to be. Just quiet. Real quiet. A week after moving in, I found him. A small, wiry stray hiding behind a dumpster near the motor pool. Brown fur-matted ribs sharp against thin skin. One ear folded down like life had pushed it that way, and it stayed. He didn't trust anyone at first. When I reached out, he flinched like he'd learned a long time ago that hands hurt. I understood that kind of flinch too well. I sat on the pavement for 10 minutes letting him decide, and eventually he crept forward, one paw at a time. I took him home that night. I named him Echo, because sometimes silence isn't empty, it remembers. He followed me everywhere after that, slept at the foot of the bed, curled up like he was guarding something he didn't quite have words for. Sometimes at night, when the house was dark and the world was still, I'd look down and see him curled against the wall, breathing steadily. I'd think about how I had spent years living with a man who believed loyalty meant obedience. And now, here was this small creature loyal without asking for anything except kindness. I kept working, of course. The army doesn't stop just because one war ends. But my world shifted. I started running again every morning like I used to before everything got heavy. On those runs, the cold air bit at my cheeks, but it didn't hurt anymore. It felt alive. Fayetteville streets stretched out ahead of me, clean and familiar. My boots hit the pavement in rhythm with my breath, and Echo trotted at my side on a leash tail, wagging like he was keeping pace with something bigger than both of us. Some mornings I'd pass the base housing and catch a glimpse of the place where everything had started to crack. The kitchen window, the porch light. But it didn't own me anymore. It was just a building, 4 walls, a place where someone once believed they could control me. And they were wrong. The legal noise faded over the months. Charles disappeared into the federal system, a name on a docket, a man serving a sentence in a place far away from here. The papers stopped mentioning him after a while. People on base moved on to new rumors, new stories. The empire he built became just another cautionary tale whispered over bad coffee. And me, I kept living, quietly, intentionally. I didn't rebuild the old version of myself. That version had spent too many years surviving. I built something new instead. On a crisp morning in late April, I stood in front of the mirror in my PT uniform. The fabric felt familiar, solid, like armor, but also like home. Echo sat by the door, ears perked, waiting for me to lace my boots. I stepped outside, and the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the smell of early spring wet earth, fresh cut grass, and a kind of light that felt clean. I started running. My steps fell into rhythm almost immediately, steady and strong. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but the horizon was painted in soft gold, like the world itself was starting over. And as I ran, a thought settled into me, not like an explosion, but like a truth that had always been there, waiting. Some wars aren't fought overseas. Some are fought at home, and sometimes the enemy eats at your table. I kept running. Past the quiet houses, past the empty road, past the version of me who used to believe silence was the only way to survive. I didn't need a headline. I didn't need applause. I didn't need to explain what it cost. The people who've lived it already know. I slowed down near the end of the loop, breath, steady echo still trotting next to me. For the first time in years, I felt something like peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was mine. No one could take that from me again. If you've ever stood alone at that table, tell me where you're watching from. I read every story.